The morning fog rolled thick across Naval Base San Diego, transforming the California coastline into something ancient and unknowable. Through this gray veil, a small figure walked with purpose that belied her 12 years. Reese Blackwood. She carried a worn leather rifle case that had once belonged to her mother. The weight of it wasn't physical. Reese had carried it dozens of times before, knew every scuff mark on the leather, every brass fitting that had oxidized to green patina over years of use. No, the weight was something else entirely. Today marked 3 years since Lieutenant Natasha Wraith Blackwood had been killed in action during a classified operation in Afghanistan. 3 years since Reese's world had collapsed into a silence that even now she hadn't fully learned how to fill. The rifle case bumped against her leg with each step, a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Inside, cleaning supplies, hand-loaded ammunition, a shooting glove worn smooth by her mother's hands, and a data book filled with ballistic calculations in Natasha's precise handwriting. Reese had memorized every page, every number, every notation her mother had made during a career that had established records still unbroken. Beside her walked Jackson Blackwood, 42 years old and carrying his own weight of ghosts. His maintenance supervisor uniform marked him as civilian personnel now. But his bearing, the way he scanned intersections before crossing, the subtle positioning that kept Reese on his protected side, betrayed 2 decades as a Navy SEAL. Some habits couldn't be shed like uniforms. Some instincts were etched too deep. "Remember what we talked about, kiddo?" Jackson said quietly as they approached the officers' club. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd spent 3 years trying to balance protection with permission. "Some people might not understand why you want to use the range today." Reese's hand moved instinctively to the silver trident pendant at her throat. Natasha's trident, awarded for completing basic underwater demolition SEAL training before women were officially allowed in such programs. The small piece of metal caught what little light penetrated the fog, throwing back a gleam that seemed too bright for such gray surroundings. "I understand, Dad," Reese replied with the careful formality she'd absorbed from 12 years of military life. "But Mom would have wanted me to keep practicing. She always said skills fade if you don't maintain them." Jackson looked down at his daughter, seeing in her serious expression an echo of the woman he'd loved and lost. Reese had Natasha's eyes, that same focused intensity that could shut out the world when concentrating on a target. She had Natasha's discipline, too. Waking at 5 every morning to run, to train, to maintain the gift her mother had passed down through blood and repetition. The officers' club bustled with Monday morning activity as they entered. Off-duty personnel grabbed coffee and breakfast before reporting to various duties. The building's traditional naval decor created an atmosphere that felt both institutional and strangely homey. Ship wheels and anchor motifs adorned walls covered with framed photographs of famous naval battles and decorated warriors. Reese had always found comfort in these reminders of naval tradition. They connected her to something larger than her own small world of base housing and civilian schools. Today, however, the familiar surroundings felt different, charged, as though the building itself sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Near the main dining area, a group of SEALs had gathered around Colonel Garrett Thorne, who was regaling them with stories from his weekend golf game. At 48, Thorne commanded attention through sheer physical presence and the kind of loud confidence that came from 25 years of military service in increasingly administrative roles. His broad shoulders and thick neck gave him the appearance of someone who spent considerable time in weight rooms, while his precisely groomed appearance suggested a man more comfortable with paperwork than fieldwork. "So there I was," Thorne was saying, his voice carrying easily across the dining area. "Perfect lie on the 18th fairway when this weekend warrior in the foursome ahead starts giving me advice about my swing. 25 years in the Navy, and some civilian thinks he knows better than a colonel." The SEALs around him chuckled appropriately, a mix of active duty operators and support personnel who understood the importance of laughing at senior officer stories regardless of their entertainment value. Among them stood Lieutenant Kieran Ashford, 29 years old, with an easy smile, recently returned from deployment, and Chief Malcolm Sterling, 45, and still adjusting to the unique culture of special operations support after years in standard fleet duty. Thorne's storytelling was interrupted when his gaze fell on Reese, who had wandered slightly away from her father to examine a display case containing historical naval artifacts near the club's entrance. The sight of the small figure studying military memorabilia with obvious fascination seemed to trigger something in Thorne's expression. His features shifted from amiable storytelling mode to something more critical and disapproving. "Well, well," Thorne said loudly enough to draw attention from other patrons. "What do we have here?" Reese looked up from the display case, immediately recognizing the tone of voice that adults used when they were about to say something unpleasant. She had heard it often enough in the 3 years since her mother's death, usually from people who thought they knew better than a child what constituted appropriate behavior for someone her age. The silver trident pendant caught the morning light filtering through the club's windows, creating small reflections that danced across the polished floor. Thorne approached with the deliberate stride of someone accustomed to intimidating subordinates. His polished dress shoes clicked against the tile floor with military precision. "Little girl," Thorne said with theatrical concern, "you know this is an officers' club, right? Not a tourist attraction." The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to embarrass rather than elicit an actual response. Reese felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained the kind of steady eye contact her mother had taught her was essential when facing down bullies, whether they wore uniforms or not. "Yes, sir, I know where I am," Reese replied with careful politeness. "My father is submitting his weekly reports to Major Vaughn. I was just waiting for him." "And what exactly are you carrying in that case?" Thorne continued, his voice taking on the kind of parade ground authority that made nearby conversations fall silent. "Looks pretty serious for a little girl's toy." Jackson heard his daughter's voice and immediately abandoned his conversation with Major Deirdre Vaughn to move toward what was clearly becoming a confrontation. But Reese's response came before he could intervene, her voice carrying across the dining area with surprising clarity. "It's not a toy, sir. It's my shooting kit." The statement drew murmurs from the SEALs who had gathered to watch Thorne's performance, some recognizing the serious tone in the girl's voice, while others seemed amused by what they assumed was childhood fantasy. Thorne's expression showed no softening at this information. If anything, it seemed to harden further, as though Reese's claim to possess shooting equipment made her presence in the officers' club more inappropriate rather than less. "A shooting kit," Thorne repeated with theatrical skepticism. "And I suppose Daddy lets you play with real guns too." Before Reese could respond, Jackson reached the group with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested violence was being actively suppressed beneath a thin veneer of military discipline. "Colonel Thorne," Jackson said carefully, his voice carrying just enough edge to indicate that courtesy was being extended rather than naturally felt. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here." Thorne turned his attention to Jackson, taking in the maintenance supervisor uniform and drawing immediate conclusions about social hierarchy and military status. The colonel's expression suggested someone encountering an insect that had wandered into an inappropriate location. "No misunderstanding at all, Blackwood," Thorne said with dismissive authority. "Your daughter is in an officers' club talking about shooting equipment like she's some kind of marksman. That's inappropriate behavior that reflects poorly on military families." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jackson found himself caught between the desire to protect his daughter and the practical reality that Thorne's position on base could make their lives significantly more difficult if handled poorly. The maintenance contracts that provided Jackson's livelihood depended on maintaining positive relationships with base command. But watching his daughter being publicly humiliated was testing every limit of his self-control. "Sir," Jackson said with forced calm, "Reese has been trained in proper firearm safety and marksmanship. Her mother was Lieutenant Natasha Blackwood, Marine Scout sniper. She started teaching Reese when she was 7 years old." "Natasha Blackwood," Thorne said slowly as though the name meant nothing to him. "Can't say I'm familiar with any Lieutenant Blackwood. What was her job?" "Administrative support, food service." The casual dismissal of Natasha's service hit both Jackson and Reese like a physical blow. Lieutenant Natasha Blackwood had been one of the Marine Corps' most accomplished snipers before her death. 47 confirmed kills and decorations that remained classified even 3 years after her funeral. For Thorne to suggest she had been anything less than an elite warrior demonstrated either ignorance or deliberate disrespect. "My mother was a Marine sniper," Reese said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled emotion that made several nearby SEALs shift uncomfortably. "She taught me everything she knew about marksmanship." Thorne's laugh was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the club's vaulted ceiling like the crack of a whip. "A Marine sniper, right?" Thorne said with exaggerated doubt. "And I suppose she was some kind of hero too, saving the world with her amazing shooting skills." It was at this moment that Captain Ryan Blake, who had been sitting at a nearby table nursing his morning coffee while reviewing range schedules for the week, finally stood up. At 35, Blake served as Precision Point Range's safety officer, and his trained ear had caught enough of the conversation to understand that someone was making claims about marksmanship training. Blake's professional curiosity was piqued, but his expression grew more serious as he realized the conversation was taking on an increasingly confrontational tone. Colonel Blake said respectfully as he approached the group, "I couldn't help but overhear the discussion about marksmanship training. Is there something I can assist with?" Thorne turned toward Blake with obvious irritation about having his demonstration interrupted. "Captain Blake," Thorne said dismissively, "this little girl claims her mother was some kind of Marine sniper and that she's been trained to shoot. I was just explaining to her father that children shouldn't be making up stories about military service." Blake looked between Thorne and Reese, noting the girl's composed demeanor and the serious way she held herself. In his years as a range safety officer, Blake had learned to distinguish between genuine training and childhood fantasies, and something about Reese's bearing suggested the former rather than the latter. "Miss Blackwood," Blake said directly to Reese, treating her as he would any adult making similar claims, "what kind of training have you received?" Reese straightened slightly, recognizing that she was being addressed by someone who understood firearms training. "Basic weapons, safety sight, alignment, breathing techniques, trigger control, and range estimation," Reese replied without hesitation. "My mother started with fundamentals and worked up to precision, shooting at various distances." The technical accuracy of Reese's response impressed Blake, who was accustomed to dealing with adult personnel who often struggled to articulate basic marksmanship principles. The girl's mature approach to discussing firearms training suggested either exceptional instruction or natural understanding that went beyond casual exposure. "And what's your experience with different weapon systems?" Blake asked, his professional interest overriding the social awkwardness of the situation. "I've trained primarily with bolt-action rifles and some semi-automatic platforms," Reese replied. "Mom said consistency was more important than variety until the fundamentals were completely automatic." It was at this moment that Master Chief Sloan Winters entered the officers' club, drawn by reports of unusual activity involving civilian personnel and weapons training discussions. At 38, Winters had established herself as one of the Navy's premier marksmanship instructors with combat experience that included deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Her reputation for excellence transcended gender boundaries in the traditionally male-dominated world of military sniping. Winters approached the group with the measured stride of someone accustomed to evaluating situations before taking action. Her eyes moved quickly over the assembled personnel before settling on Reese with obvious professional interest. Something about the girl's posture and the way she discussed firearms training triggered recognition in Winters' memory. "Lieutenant Natasha Blackwood," Winters said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the immediate group. "Wraith, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, Ramadi, 2006. Best natural shooter I ever worked with." The identification hit Jackson like an electric shock, confirming not only that Winters had known his wife, but that she remembered Natasha's call sign and unit designation with the kind of precision that indicated significant professional respect. Reese's eyes widened as she realized she was meeting someone who had actually served with her mother in combat operations. "You knew her," Reese said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying across the suddenly quiet dining area. "I knew her," Winters confirmed, her expression softening as she studied Reese's features and recognized unmistakable family resemblance. "She could put 5 rounds through a quarter at 400 meters in conditions that would challenge most trained snipers. Your mother saved lives with those skills." Thorne's confident demeanor faltered slightly as Winters' testimony contradicted his dismissive assumptions about Natasha Blackwood's military service. The colonel found himself in the uncomfortable position of having publicly questioned the service of a decorated veteran while a subject matter expert provided contradictory evidence. "Master Chief," Thorne said carefully, "I wasn't aware you had served with supposed sniper personnel in combat theaters." The word "supposed" carried enough edge that Winters' expression hardened noticeably. Colonel Winters said with dangerous quiet, "There was nothing supposed about Lieutenant Blackwood's service. She was killed in action during a classified operation that I cannot discuss, but her sacrifice allowed 12 Marines to return home to their families." The confirmation of Natasha's combat record from someone with Winters' credentials fundamentally altered the context of the confrontation. Thorne found himself facing the reality that he had been publicly mocking the daughter of a war hero while demonstrating ignorance about personnel who had served under his overall command structure. Reese felt validation washing over her like a tide, confirming everything she had been taught to believe about her mother's service and sacrifice. Having someone with Master Chief Winters' obvious expertise acknowledge Natasha's abilities provided the kind of official recognition that had been missing from 3 years of private grief and memory. "Master Chief," Reese said with growing confidence, Would it be possible for me to use precision point range today? I'd like to honor my mother's memory by maintaining the skills she taught me. The request was made with such sincere respect that it took Thorne several seconds to process the implications. When understanding dawned, his expression shifted to something between amusement and outright mockery at what he perceived as a child's presumptuous demand for access to military training facilities. "Oh, really?" Thorne said with elaborate sarcasm. "The little girl wants to play soldier on a real military range. What's next? Maybe she thinks she can qualify for SEAL training too." The cruel dismissal created a moment of uncomfortable silence as everyone present recognized that Thorne was crossing lines of basic decency in his treatment of a military dependent. Several SEALs shifted uncomfortably, their expressions suggesting growing unease with their colonel's handling of what should have been a simple family matter. Winters stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of training elite personnel under the most demanding conditions. Colonel Lee Winters said firmly, "If Miss Blackwood has been properly trained in firearms safety and marksmanship, there's no regulation preventing her from using base facilities under appropriate supervision." "Are you seriously suggesting," Thorne said with obvious disbelief, "that we allow a 12-year-old girl to use military weapons based on her claims about training from her dead mother?" The brutally dismissive reference to Natasha's death created a reaction that rippled through the assembled group like an electric shock. Jackson's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to maintain the kind of control that separated civilization from violence, while Reese's composure showed signs of strain for the first time since the confrontation began. "Colonel Thorne," Winters said with quiet menace, "I suggest you reconsider both your tone and your assumptions about Miss Blackwood's capabilities." Before Thorne could respond to what was clearly a warning from a senior enlisted person to a commissioned officer, Reese made a decision that would change everything for everyone present. "Colonel Thorne," she said with a kind of calm certainty that cut through all the adult posturing and institutional politics, "if you don't believe my mother taught me anything useful, I'd be happy to demonstrate what I learned." The offer was made with such straightforward sincerity that it took Thorne several seconds to understand that a 12-year-old girl was challenging him to put his skepticism to a practical test. When the implications became clear, his expression shifted to something approaching cruel delight as he recognized an opportunity to decisively humiliate both the Blackwood family and anyone who had suggested taking the girl's claims seriously. "You know what?" Thorne said with theatrical enthusiasm that typically preceded someone's public destruction. "I think that's an excellent idea. Let's see exactly what kind of training a little girl received from her supposedly expert mother." Blake felt his professional obligations colliding with his growing discomfort about the direction this confrontation was heading. Colonel Blake said carefully, "If we're going to do this, it needs to be under proper safety protocols with appropriate supervision." "Absolutely," Thorne agreed with obvious satisfaction. "Full safety protocols, proper supervision, and witnesses to document exactly what happens when children try to play with adult weapons." Winters caught Reese's eye and saw in the girl's expression the same focused determination that had characterized Natasha Blackwood's approach to impossible challenges. "Miss Blackwood," Winters said seriously, "are you certain you want to do this? Once we get to the range, there won't be any backing down." Reese looked up at her father, seeing in his expression the same conflict that had defined much of their relationship since Natasha's death. Jackson wanted to protect her from exactly this kind of public scrutiny, but he also understood that backing down now would validate every dismissive assumption Thorne had made about their family's military legacy. "Dad," Reese said quietly, "it's okay. I want to do this." Jackson studied his daughter's face, seeing in her features the same determined expression that Natasha had worn when facing impossible odds in situations where failure meant death. The resemblance was so strong it made his chest tighten with grief and pride in equal measure. "All right." Jackson nodded slowly, then turned toward Thorne with a new edge in his voice that suggested the colonel might want to reconsider his assumptions. "Let's go to the range." As the impromptu group began moving toward the officers' club exit, Reese walked beside Master Chief Winters with obvious eagerness to learn from someone who had known her mother personally. It was at this crucial juncture that Sergeant Major Declan Frost emerged from the base library where he'd been researching historical marksmanship records for a consulting project. At 66 years old, Frost carried himself with the weathered dignity of a man who'd spent 38 years in uniform, most of it in places where survival depended on being harder than the enemy. Frost had enlisted in 1976, served in West Germany during the tense final years of the Cold War, fought in the First Gulf War, and spent his final decade training the next generation of warriors before retiring in 2014. His face bore the map of hard service scars from shrapnel, sun-weathered skin from desert deployments, eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. "What's all the commotion?" Frost asked as he fell into step beside the growing procession heading toward the range. Sergeant Major Lieutenant Ashford explained with barely concealed amusement, "We're about to witness Colonel Thorne prove that a 12-year-old girl can't shoot." Frost's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Who's the kid?" "Reese Blackwood. Says her mother was Natasha Blackwood, Marine sniper." Frost stopped walking. The officers and enlisted personnel continued past him, but he stood perfectly still processing that name with the careful attention of someone who'd learned long ago that some details demanded absolute focus. "Natasha Blackwood," Frost said quietly. "Wraith, 2nd MEF. "You knew her, Sergeant Major?" Wenders asked, having noticed Frost's reaction. "Trained at her in 2005. Frost replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Young Marine, maybe 21 years old. Showed up at my advanced precision course with more raw talent than anyone I'd seen in 30 years. Coldest natural shooter I ever worked with. Eyes like a predator. Saw things other people missed." Frost resumed walking, but his posture had changed. Where before he'd been casually interested, now he moved with purpose. "This is her daughter?" Frost asked. "Yes, Sergeant Major," Reese said, having fallen back to walk near the legendary instructor. "She started teaching me when I was 7. Frost looked down at Reese, studying her face with the evaluating gaze of someone who'd spent decades assessing warriors. He saw Natasha's bone structure, Natasha's focused intensity, and something else, a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of. "Your mother never bragged," Frost said. "Never needed to. Let her shooting do the talking." He glanced ahead at Thorne, who was still pontificating to his audience. "Some people are the opposite. All talk, no demonstration." Reese smiled slightly. It was the first genuine expression of pleasure she'd shown since the confrontation began. The procession reached precision point range, and the setting could not have been more perfect for what was about to unfold. The facility sprawled across a natural valley between two coastal ridges, its concrete firing positions and steel target frameworks creating geometric patterns against the wild California landscape. The range could accommodate everything from basic pistol qualification to advanced sniper training, with lanes extending from 25 meters out to an impressive 800 meters. Chief Malcolm Sterling had been conducting routine maintenance when the unusual group arrived. At 45, Sterling had spent 20 years as a range safety officer, and his professional instincts immediately kicked in when he saw civilians among the military personnel. "Captain Blake," Sterling called out, "what is the situation?" "Civilian marksmanship demonstration, Chief," Blake replied. "Miss Reese Blackwood, age 12, claims advanced training. Colonel Thorne has requested a formal evaluation under safety protocols." Sterling's weathered face showed skepticism, not hostile, just the careful doubt of someone who'd seen too many people overestimate their abilities with lethal weapons. "Miss Blackwood," Sterling said, approaching Reese with the no-nonsense demeanor of a man who took safety seriously, "I need to verify your knowledge of basic weapon safety before we proceed. This isn't negotiable." "I understand, Chief," Reese replied. "I'm ready." For the next 15 minutes, Sterling conducted an informal but thorough evaluation of Reese's understanding of fundamental safety principles, range procedures, and emergency protocols. He started with what he expected to be softball questions, the kind that would expose someone who'd merely memorized phrases without understanding. "Weapon condition checks," Sterling said. "Visual inspection of chamber and magazine, well followed by physical verification with chamber flag or finger check." Reese replied without hesitation. "Never assume a weapon is safe based on someone else's confirmation." Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly. That was the correct answer. Not just technically accurate, but philosophically sound. "Malfunction procedures. Stop. Maintain muzzle discipline. Engage safety if possible. Signal range safety officer for assistance. Never attempt to clear complex malfunctions without supervision. Environmental safety considerations. Backstop verification range boundaries. Personnel locations, ricochet potential from hard surfaces or angled targets." Each answer demonstrated the kind of comprehensive training that typically required months of intensive instruction to develop. Sterling found himself increasingly impressed by the depth and accuracy of Reese's knowledge, recognizing teaching methods that reflected both expertise and careful attention to student development. "Miss Blackwood," Sterling concluded, his voice carrying newfound respect, "your safety knowledge exceeds that of many adult students I've worked with. Who provided your instruction? My mother, Reese replied simply. She said that safety was more important than accuracy because mistakes with weapons can't be undone. The mature understanding implicit in Reese's response impressed everyone present who understood the psychological complexity of handling lethal equipment responsibly. Sterling looked at Frost, who nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent communication between professionals who'd spent decades evaluating warriors. The kid knows her business, Sergeant Major, Sterling said quietly. Never doubted it, Frost replied. She's Natasha Blackwood's daughter. The evaluation complete, the group moved toward the actual firing positions. Reese opened her leather case to reveal a collection of shooting accessories that impressed the military professionals present. The case contained hearing protection, shooting glasses rated for ballistic impact, a worn leather shooting glove, a ranged notebook filled with data, and various tools for sight adjustment and equipment maintenance. Everything showed signs of regular use rather than ceremonial display. That's professional-grade equipment, Ashford observed quietly to Commander Nathan Hawk, who had joined the group. Not casual recreational shooting gear. Hawk, at 41, commanded one of the base's active SEAL teams and possessed combat experience that included multiple deployments where marksmanship skills determined survival. He studied Reese's systematic preparation routine with growing professional interest. Someone invested significant time and money in her training setup. Hawk agreed. That's not birthday present equipment. That's operator gear. Winters had been watching Reese's preparation routine, recognizing methods and habits that reflected Natasha's systematic approach to marksmanship training. Natasha always said that proper preparation was half of accurate shooting, Winters commented. Equipment checks, environmental assessment, mental preparation before touching the weapon. The range itself stretched across carefully maintained grounds that provided clear sight lines and controlled lighting conditions for precision shooting. Target frames stood at measured intervals, their distances marked with signs that indicated both metric and yard measurements for international training compatibility. The morning coastal fog had completely lifted, revealing optimal visibility conditions that would eliminate environmental excuses for poor performance. Blake had been preparing equipment and targets while the preliminary evaluations were conducted. As range safety officer, his primary responsibility was ensuring that all activities followed established protocols while maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate unusual training situations. We'll start with basic familiarization at 25 meters, Blake announced after completing his preparation checklist. Standard target supported position 5 rounds for initial assessment. Thorne positioned himself where he could observe both Reese's shooting technique and the target results, anticipating the moment when reality would deflate the girl's pretensions and validate his assessment of the situation. His confidence remained high despite the professional preparation surrounding the demonstration. He simply couldn't conceive of a 12-year-old girl possessing skills that rivaled those of trained military personnel. I want everyone to understand, Thorne declared to the assembled observers. We're witnessing exactly why the military has age and training requirements. Natural talent doesn't replace proper instruction and experience. Reese had been listening to these pronouncements while conducting her own environmental assessment of wind conditions, lighting, and range setup. Her systematic approach to evaluating shooting conditions impressed the military professionals present, who recognized behaviors that reflected serious training rather than childhood enthusiasm. Thermal activity is minimal this morning, Reese observed to Winters. Wind flags indicate consistent left-to-right movement at approximately 3 miles per hour. Should be favorable conditions for precision work. Winters smiled slightly at Reese's technical assessment, remembering similar conversations with Natasha in far more dangerous environments where such observations determine mission success or failure. Your mother would be proud of your situational awareness, Winters said quietly. As Blake completed the final safety checks and target setup, Reese settled into a supported prone position behind the M16A4 rifle that had been selected for the initial demonstration. Her body alignment and weapon handling showed none of the hesitation or uncertainty that typically characterize first-time shooters. Instead, she displayed the fluid competence that came from hundreds of hours of careful practice. The rifle felt familiar in her hands. Not this exact weapon, but the platform itself. She'd trained on M16 variants since she was 8 years old, had learned to field strip and reassemble the weapon blindfolded, understood its ballistics and characteristics like some children understood their favorite toys. Reese adjusted the stock to fit her smaller frame, checked the sight alignment, verified the safety was engaged. Each movement was economical, purposeful, the product of endless repetition until proper procedure became muscle memory. Ready when you are, Miss Blackwood, Blake said, his professional tone now carrying a note of genuine interest rather than mere protocol. Reese chambered around with smooth efficiency, the metallic click of the bolt echoing across the suddenly quiet range. She settled into her shooting position, adjusting the sandbag rest beneath the rifle's forend, finding that perfect point of stability where the weapon seemed to float rather than rest. Her breathing settled into the four-count cycle Natasha had drilled into her during countless weekend training sessions. Inhale fully through the nose. Exhale halfway through the mouth. Hold at the natural respiratory pause. Squeeze the trigger during that moment of absolute stillness. The silence that descended over precision point range held the weight of institutional skepticism and family honor as Reese prepared to demonstrate whether her mother's legacy lived on through more than just memory and silver trinkets. Through the rifle's iron sights, the target 25 meters downrange appeared crisp and clear, its black bullseye standing out against the white background like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The coastal breeze had stilled to barely a whisper, creating ideal conditions that would eliminate any environmental excuses for poor performance. Reese's world narrowed to the fundamentals: sight alignment, sight picture, breathing, trigger control. Everything else, the watching crowd, Thorne's skepticism, her own nervousness faded into background noise that couldn't penetrate the zone of concentration her mother had taught her to achieve. The trigger press was smooth and deliberate, breaking cleanly with the kind of technique that typically required months of intensive training to develop properly. The sharp crack of the rifle shot echoed off the surrounding hills, followed immediately by the distinctive ping of a bullet striking steel. Through his binoculars, Commander Hawk observed the target with professional assessment. His expression shifted from polite interest to genuine surprise as he announced his findings. "Dead center bullseye," Hawk called out, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "Clean hit. Textbook placement." Colonel Thorne had positioned himself where he could watch both Reese's technique and the target results, expecting to witness the kind of scattered shots that would validate his assumptions about children attempting adult activities. The single-centered hit was impressive, but hardly conclusive evidence of exceptional ability that couldn't be attributed to beginner's luck. "One shot proves nothing," Thorne declared with confident dismissal. "Anyone can get lucky once with proper equipment and favorable conditions." Master Chief Winters stepped forward with the calm authority that came from years of training elite marksmen under combat conditions. "Miss Blackwood," Winters said formally, "would you be comfortable firing a complete qualification string, 5 rounds, standard scoring, measured group size?" "Yes, ma'am," Reese replied without lifting her eye from the sight picture. The formal military address drew approving nods from the personnel present, demonstrating respect for rank that went beyond surface politeness and reflected genuine understanding of military culture. What followed silenced every skeptical comment and dismissive prediction that had been voiced since the confrontation began at the officers' club. Reese's second shot struck within inches of the first, followed by 3 more rounds that created a grouping so tight it appeared to be a single enlarged hole in the target's center ring. The precision was so consistent that several observers initially suspected a malfunction with the target system. Captain Blake lowered his binoculars with an expression of professional amazement that he made no attempt to conceal. 5 rounds, approximately 0.94 inches at the 25 meters, Blake announced, his voice carrying across the range. "That exceeds expert qualification standards by any measure." The announcement created ripples of conversation among the military personnel who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a child's embarrassing failure. Lieutenant Ashford found himself reconsidering every assumption he had made about civilian training capabilities, while Chief Sterling stared at the target display with the kind of awe typically reserved for watching professionals perform seemingly impossible feats. Ashford moved closer to examine the target through his own optics, confirming the group size and shot placement with the systematic approach of someone trained to evaluate marksmanship performance objectively. "That's not luck," Ashford said quietly to Sterling. "That's fundamental skill applied with exceptional consistency." Sterling nodded agreement while studying the systematic way Reese prepared her equipment for the next evolution. Someone had invested significant time and expertise in her training, creating a foundation of confidence that exceeded what most recruits brought to their first qualification courses. Thorne's confident demeanor showed the first cracks as he processed results that directly contradicted his expectations and public predictions. The colonel found himself in the uncomfortable position of watching a 12-year-old girl demonstrate shooting abilities that exceeded those of many personnel under his command. "Fine," Thorne said with forced bravado. "She can hit a target at close range under controlled conditions. But 25 meters isn't real marksmanship. Any recruit can be taught to group shots when the target is practically close enough to touch. Sergeant Major Frost had been observing Reese's performance with the evaluating gaze of someone who'd trained thousands of shooters over nearly 4 decades. He recognized in her technique the kind of fundamental soundness that separated genuine talent from temporary luck. Colonel Frost said with the gravelly authority of a senior NCO who'd earned the right to speak plainly that performance demonstrates both technical competence and appropriate stress management under public scrutiny. Perhaps we should consider what distance would provide a more comprehensive evaluation. The suggestion was clearly designed to put Thorne in the position of either backing down from his challenge or escalating to distances where failure would be more likely and less embarrassing for everyone involved. Thorne's pride wouldn't allow him to retreat from the confrontation he had initiated regardless of the mounting evidence that his assumptions might be fundamentally flawed. Real marksmen qualify at 300 meters, Thorne announced with the kind of authority that made retreat impossible. If she's genuinely skilled, let's see how she performs at a distance where environmental factors and technical precision actually matter. Winters turned toward Thorne with the patient expression of an instructor dealing with a particularly stubborn student who refused to acknowledge obvious evidence. Colonel De Winter said carefully, 300-meter shooting requires different equipment, more complex sight adjustments, and environmental compensation that challenges experienced marksmen. Exactly my point, Thorne replied with satisfaction. Let's separate genuine skill from beginner's luck by testing her abilities under conditions that require real expertise. Reese lifted her head from the rifle scope for the first time since beginning her demonstration, looking toward her father with a questioning expression that sought permission rather than validation. Jackson felt his throat tighten as he recognized in his daughter's face the same focused determination that had characterized Natasha's approach to impossible challenges in hostile environments. Reese, Jackson said quietly, you don't have to prove anything more to anyone. I know, Dad, she replied with gentle firmness that reminded him powerfully of Natasha's voice during their final conversation before her last deployment. But I want to show them what Mom taught me. Commander Hawk found himself caught between institutional responsibility and growing curiosity about Reese's actual capabilities. The girl's performance at 25 meters had been genuinely impressive, but 300-meter shooting involved technical complexities that challenged even experienced military marksmen. Miss Blackwood, Hawk said carefully, extended-range shooting requires advanced equipment and procedures. Sight adjustments become more complex. Wind becomes a significant factor, and small errors in technique are magnified dramatically. I understand, sir, Reese replied respectfully. My mother taught me about ballistic calculation, wind reading, and environmental compensation. She said that precision shooting was 90% mental discipline and 10% physical technique. Chief Sterling had been evaluating Reese's responses and demeanor throughout the initial demonstration, recognizing training methods and attitudes that reflected serious instruction rather than casual hobby shooting. Miss Blackwood, Sterling asked, testing her knowledge with a technical question designed to reveal the depth of her understanding. What's your experience with different ammunition types and their ballistic characteristics? The question was intended to determine whether Reese's knowledge extended beyond basic marksmanship into the kind of advanced understanding required for precision shooting at extended distances. Her answer would indicate whether her training had been comprehensive or limited to fundamental skills. Match-grade ammunition provides better consistency than military ball ammunition, Reese replied without hesitation. Bullet weight affects trajectory and wind drift with heavier bullets, generally providing better performance in crosswinds, but requiring more elevation adjustment for longer distances. The casual precision of her ballistic knowledge impressed everyone present who possessed sufficient technical background to evaluate its accuracy. Ashford exchanged a meaningful glance with Hawk, both recognizing that Reese's understanding far exceeded what would be expected from recreational training or casual instruction. Blake had been preparing the 300-meter range while listening to the technical discussion, understanding that institutional credibility was now at stake. Regardless of Reese's performance, the equipment required for extended range work represented a significant step up in complexity from the basic rifle used for the initial demonstration. Equipment is ready for extended range work, Blake announced. We have an M40A3 bolt-action rifle with Schmidt and Bender variable power scope, shooting rest, and wind measurement devices. As the group moved toward the longer range facility, Reese walked beside Winters with obvious eagerness to learn from someone who had worked alongside her mother in combat situations. The transition between range sections provided a brief respite from the intensity of public scrutiny allowing Reese to process what had already occurred. Master Chief, Reese asked quietly as they walked, did my mother ever talk about teaching me advanced marksmanship? She talked about you constantly. Winters replied with a slight smile that transformed her typically serious expression. Natasha was incredibly proud of your natural ability, but she was also concerned about ensuring you understood the ethical responsibilities that come with lethal skills. The mention of ethical considerations demonstrated that Natasha's training had extended beyond technical instruction into moral development, addressing the psychological complexity of possessing abilities that could cause harm if misused. The mature understanding implicit in this approach impressed the professionals who overheard the conversation. Your mother understood that exceptional marksmanship comes with obligations, Winters continued as they approached the extended range facility. She wanted you to develop both the skill and the judgment necessary to use those abilities appropriately. The 300-meter range stretched across a natural depression in the coastal terrain, with target frameworks positioned at precise distances and marked with range indicators that accounted for both metric and imperial measurements. The setup required more sophisticated equipment than the basic range, including wind measurement devices and spotting scopes that could accurately assess shot placement at extended distances. Thorne had been observing the professional preparations with growing unease about the direction events were taking. What had begun as an opportunity to humiliate a presumptuous child was evolving into a formal evaluation that might produce results he wasn't prepared to acknowledge or accept. I want everyone to understand, Thorne announced to the growing crowd of observers, we're about to demonstrate exactly why military training requirements exist. Complex skills can't be learned through casual instruction, regardless of family connections or natural talent. Ashford had been configuring the bolt-action rifle and variable power scope, while Blake established the target and safety protocols for extended range work. The M40A3 represented the same weapon system Natasha had used during her service in Iraq and Afghanistan, a connection that wasn't lost on those who understood the significance. Miss Blackwood, Ashford said, as he completed the rifle preparation, this system requires different sight alignment and trigger technique than the weapon you used earlier. Would you like a few minutes to familiarize yourself with the equipment? Reese approached the rifle with the same systematic attention to detail she had demonstrated throughout the morning, examining the scope adjustment mechanisms in bolt operation with the kind of methodical assessment that impressed military professionals present. Her handling of the unfamiliar weapon showed confidence without recklessness, suggesting training that had emphasized adaptability rather than dependence on specific equipment. The scope is set for 200 meters, Reese observed after examining the elevation adjustment. I'll need to compensate for the additional 100 meters plus wind drift from the current left-to-right movement. The technical accuracy of her assessment drew nods of approval from the experienced marksmen present, who recognized that Reese was approaching the challenge with the kind of systematic analysis that separated competent shooters from those who relied on luck or favorable conditions. Frost had positioned himself where he could both observe Reese's technique and provide context for the less experienced personnel watching the demonstration. As a man who had trained elite marksmen for decades, Frost understood the value of education in moments like these. 300 meters doesn't sound like much, Frost said, his voice carrying to the gathered observers. But wind drift at this distance becomes a critical factor. A Sierra Match King 168 grain bullet at muzzle velocity of 2650 feet per second will drift approximately 1.7 inches for every mile per hour of crosswind. She needs to calculate wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, and altitude, and she's 12 years old. The technical explanation provided context that helped the watching personnel understand exactly what they were about to witness. Frost's narration served dual purposes, educating those unfamiliar with precision marksmanship, while simultaneously building anticipation for Reese's attempt. Reese settled into position behind the scoped rifle, her movements deliberate and focused. She began checking wind flags at 100 meters, 200 meters, and 300 meters, a professional technique that veterans recognized as advanced procedure not typically taught to novice shooters. Through the scope, she noted the mirage pattern, the heat shimmer that could affect bullet flight, and required compensation from experienced marksmen. The morning sun had climbed higher, creating thermal effects that would influence trajectory calculations. Master Chief, Reese said quietly to Winters, who had positioned herself as the primary safety observer. The mirage pattern suggests a slight thermal rise near the target. Should I compensate with additional elevation or wait for conditions to stabilize? The technical sophistication of the question impressed everyone within hearing range who understood advanced marksmanship principles. Reese wasn't just going through mechanical procedures, she was actively analyzing environmental conditions and considering their impact on bullet flight. Winters smiled slightly, recognizing Natasha's systematic teaching methods reflected in her daughter's analytical approach to challenging shooting conditions. "What does your training tell you about thermal effects on bullet trajectory?" Winters replied, turning the question back to Reese rather than providing direct instruction. "Rising thermals lift the bullet's path slightly, requiring less elevation adjustment than standard calculations would indicate," Reese answered without hesitation. "Mom taught me to reduce elevation by approximately half a minute when mirage patterns show significant vertical movement." Hawk had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement at the depth of Reese's technical knowledge. The girl's understanding of environmental compensation exceeded that of many personnel who had completed formal sniper training programs under military instruction. "Miss Blackwood," Hawk said with obvious respect, "that's graduate-level marksmanship theory. How did your mother teach you such advanced concepts?" "She said that understanding the science made the shooting more predictable," Reese replied while making final sight adjustments based on her environmental assessment. "If you know why bullets behave certain ways, you can compensate for conditions instead of just guessing." Major Deirdre Vaughn had arrived at the range during the equipment preparation drawn by radio reports of unusual training activity that involved civilian personnel in extended-range shooting. At 41, Vaughn served as the base operations officer and possessed the administrative authority to shut down activities that exceeded safety protocols or created liability concerns for the installation. "Captain Blake," Vaughn said as she surveyed the scene, "I understand we have a non-standard training evolution taking place. What's the current status?" Blake recognized the potential complications that official scrutiny could create for what had evolved from a simple demonstration into something approaching formal evaluation. "Major," Blake replied carefully, "we're conducting a supervised marksmanship assessment under full safety protocols. Miss Blackwood has demonstrated exceptional ability at basic distances and we're now evaluating performance at 300 meters." Vaughn studied Reese's position behind the rifle, noting the professional setup and the number of senior personnel who had gathered to observe the demonstration. The institutional attention suggested that whatever was happening had significance beyond routine training activities. "How exceptional are we talking about?" Vaughn asked, her tone indicating genuine professional interest rather than bureaucratic concern. "0.94-inch group at 25 meters, Ashford replied before anyone could downplay Reese's performance. 5 rounds, iron sights textbook technique." The specific measurement impressed Vaughn, who possessed sufficient marksmanship background to understand that such precision exceeded the capabilities of most military personnel, regardless of training level or experience. Her expression shifted from administrative caution to professional curiosity about what other surprises this unusual morning might produce. "Range is clear," Blake announced after completing his final safety verification. "Target is active at 300 meters. Wind conditions documented spotting personnel in position." The formal announcement created a moment of absolute silence as everyone present understood that they were about to witness either validation of extraordinary claims or exposure of limitations that would end the morning's drama decisively. Reese's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that preceded precision, shooting her entire focus, narrowing to the complex coordination of sight, alignment, trigger control, and environmental compensation. Through the magnified scope, the target appeared no larger than a dinner plate, its scoring rings creating concentric circles that demanded precision beyond anything most civilian shooters ever attempted. The shot that followed was preceded by several seconds of complete stillness as Reese made microscopic adjustments to her sight picture and body position. When the rifle fired, the sound seemed sharper and more authoritative than the previous demonstrations, as though the weapon itself recognized the precision being demanded of it. Through his spotting scope, Sterling tracked the bullet's path to the target with professional interest that quickly transformed into genuine astonishment. The nearly half-second of bullet flight seemed to stretch into eternity as everyone waited for impact confirmation. "Dead center bullseye," Sterling announced, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that made several observers check their own optics to confirm the impossible result. "Approximate deviation from point of aim 0. The announcement created a moment of stunned silence as the implications of Reese's performance settled over the assembled group like a revelation that challenged fundamental assumptions about talent training and the limitations of youth. Vaughn found herself staring at the target through her binoculars, desperately seeking some explanation for results that exceeded the capabilities of most trained snipers. "That's not possible," Thorne said flatly, his voice carrying the kind of denial that people used when confronted with evidence that contradicted their core beliefs. There must be an error in target placement or measurement. Ashford had been recording shot data with the systematic precision required for official documentation, understanding that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence to support institutional credibility. Colonel Ashford said professionally, "The target placement has been verified by multiple observers using calibrated equipment. The shot placement is accurate as reported." Before Thorne could challenge the measurement procedures, Hawk stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of leading personnel in life-and-death situations. "Miss Blackwood," Hawk said carefully, "would you be willing to repeat that performance? One shot doesn't constitute definitive proof of consistent ability." Reese looked up from the rifle scope with calm acceptance that suggested she had expected this challenge. The question wasn't whether she could do it again. The question was how many times she would need to prove herself before skepticism gave way to acknowledgement. "How many shots would you like me to fire, Commander?" Reese asked, her voice steady despite the pressure of multiple senior officers scrutinizing her every movement. The question was asked with such straightforward confidence that it took Hawk several seconds to formulate a response that would satisfy his need for comprehensive evaluation while maintaining realistic expectations for what any shooter could accomplish under public scrutiny. 5 rounds, Hawk decided. Standard precision shooting string, measured group size, documented conditions. "I understand," Reese replied, settling back into position with movements that had become increasingly fluid and professional as the morning progressed. 5 rounds for group measurement. What followed was a display of precision shooting that exceeded even Winter's expectations based on her knowledge of Natasha's exceptional abilities. Each shot struck within the target's center ring, creating a grouping so tight that individual bullet holes were difficult to distinguish even through high-powered optics. The rhythm of Reese's shooting demonstrated the kind of consistency that came from muscle memory, developed through thousands of repetitions. Each shot followed the same pattern: settle into position, check wind flags, note mirage, make micro-adjustments, control breathing, squeeze trigger. The mechanical precision would have been impressive in an experienced adult shooter. In a 12-year-old child, it bordered on the uncanny. When Sterling announced the final results, his voice carried the kind of professional reverence typically reserved for witnessing genuinely historic performance. 5 rounds, total group size, approximately 1.37 inches at 300 meters, Sterling said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. That exceeds advanced sniper qualification standards. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and uncomfortable, as everyone present processed the reality that they had just witnessed a 12-year-old girl demonstrate marksmanship skills that surpassed those of elite military personnel. The implications extended far beyond simple family pride into questions about talent identification, training methods, and institutional assumptions about capability development. Vaughn found herself confronting data that challenged everything she thought she understood about marksmanship development and age-related limitations. As someone responsible for base operations and training protocols, she recognized that what she was witnessing had implications for how the military identified and developed talent. "Chief Sterling," Vaughn said carefully, "are you certain about those measurements?" "Verified by multiple observers using calibrated equipment, ma'am," Sterling confirmed. "The performance is documented and consistent with advanced precision shooting standards." Thorne stared at the target through his binoculars with an expression that suggested someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. The confident predictions he had made about civilian incompetence and childish fantasies now seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly ignorant of capabilities that exceeded his own institutional experience. Frost had been watching the reactions of the assembled personnel as much as Reese's shooting performance. In his decades of military service, he'd learned that the human response to excellence often revealed more about the observer than the observed. "Outstanding shooting, Miss Blackwood," Frost said, his gravelly voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Your mother would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished today." Before Reese could respond to this emotional validation, the demonstration was interrupted by the distinctive sound of approaching helicopter rotors that announced the arrival of personnel whose presence would transform the morning's events from local curiosity into something with far-reaching implications for everyone involved. "Unscheduled aircraft inbound," Blake announced after receiving radio notification from base operations. "Pentagon identification codes, priority clearance." The unexpected arrival of high-level authority suggested that reports of Reese's performance had somehow reached decision-makers whose attention indicated either significant opportunities or serious complications for the Blackwood family. As the helicopter descended toward the base landing zone, everyone present understood that the morning's demonstration had attracted notice from levels of command that could reshape Reese's entire future. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "He killed my mother because of you," Reese said quietly, the statement carrying no accusation, only a need to understand the chain of violence that had shaped her entire life. Vivian met her granddaughter's eyes without flinching. "He killed your mother because I killed his brother in Berlin in 1985, and because Natasha killed his son in Afghanistan. This is what our world is, Reese. Blood for blood, generation after generation. And now he knows about you." Admiral Blackburn's expression hardened with professional urgency. "We need to move this discussion to a secure location immediately. Commander Hawk SEAL Team 7 on standby. Master Chief Winters, coordinate enhanced perimeter protocols." But Reese remained perfectly still, her 12-year-old mind processing tactical implications with a clarity that surprised even herself. The discipline Natasha had instilled wasn't just about shooting. It was about maintaining focus under pressure, about analyzing threats rather than succumbing to fear. "What if we don't run?" Reese asked. Every adult turned to stare at her. "Reese, this isn't a training exercise," Jackson said carefully. "Volkov has spent 40 years in intelligence work. He's dangerous." "I understand that, Dad," Reese replied, her gaze steady. "But grandmother's been running and hiding for 39 years. Mom never knew her own mother because of it, and Mom still died anyway. Maybe it's time to stop running." Vivian studied her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and terror, seeing in Reese's expression the same analytical approach to impossible situations that had characterized both Vivian's and Natasha's careers. "What are you proposing?" Vivian asked, treating Reese with the professional respect she would afford any operative presenting a tactical assessment. Reese's answer came with startling clarity. "He wants to settle accounts. He's dying, so he doesn't care about consequences. That makes him dangerous but also predictable. He'll want closure. He'll want to see all 3 generations together. So we give him that opportunity, but on our terms in a controlled environment." Hawk exchanged glances with Winters, both recognizing tactical soundness in the proposal despite its audacity. "You're suggesting we use you as bait," Hawk said. "Use a memorial ceremony as a trap." "I'm suggesting we control the battlefield," Reese corrected. "Instead of being hunted in the dark, we choose when and where. Maximum security. Our advantage." Frost stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "The kid's not wrong. Volkov's terminal illness changes the equation. If we scatter, he picks us off individually. But if we draw him out to a location we control, it's still using a 12-year-old child in a counterintelligence operation." Blackburn interrupted, though her tone suggested she was evaluating possibilities rather than rejecting them outright. Jackson looked at his daughter with emotions he couldn't fully articulate. Pride at her courage, terror at the danger, and recognition that she was thinking exactly like Natasha would have. "If we do this," Jackson said slowly, "I want maximum security, every resource available. And if anything goes wrong, Reese gets out first, non-negotiable." Blackburn nodded. "Operation Nightingale, 48-hour preparation, full spectrum security. Primary objective, apprehend Volkov. Secondary objective, protect the Blackwood family at all costs. The next 48 hours transform Naval Base San Diego into a carefully orchestrated theater of military precision and intelligence tradecraft." While public announcements circulated about a memorial ceremony honoring Lieutenant Natasha Blackwood, Vivian worked to prepare Reese for what was coming. In a secure briefing room, Vivian spread decades of intelligence files across a table. Photographs of a younger Volkov, sharp-featured and tense, standing beside other KGB officers in Cold War Berlin. In some images, he looked almost ordinary. The banality of his appearance made the knowledge of what he'd done somehow more disturbing. "Anatoly Volkov is not a monster," Vivian explained. "That's the first thing you need to understand. He's a professional who believes his actions are justified. Understanding his perspective doesn't excuse what he's done, but it helps us predict his behavior." Reese studied a photograph from 1984 Volkov and his brother Alexei at some official function, both in dress uniforms. "Tell me about Berlin. I need to understand what started this." Vivian took a deep breath. 1984. "I was 24, pregnant with your mother, working under diplomatic cover in West Berlin. My mission was to recruit Soviet intelligence officers who might defect. Alexei Volkov was my target, a KGB colonel with access to Warsaw Pact defense plans. Information that could save American lives if war came. She pulled out another file. I spent 6 months building trust with Alexei. He was brilliant, spoke 5 languages, and understood the Soviet system was failing. He wanted out. But his brother Anatoly was KGB counterintelligence watching everyone, including family. What happened? Reese asked quietly. The extraction was planning for November. Alexei would cross at checkpoint Charlie with classified documents. We'd provide new identities, relocation to America. But Anatoly discovered the plan. Vivian's voice hardened. There was a confrontation. Alexei was shot. Soviet records claim border guards killed him attempting to defect. But I learned later it was Anatoly who pulled the trigger. He executed his own brother rather than let him betray the Soviet Union. The horror of fratricide hung in the air. Anatoly blamed me, Vivian continued. From his perspective, I murdered his brother by recruiting him. When my cover was blown 6 months later, the CIA faked my death. But Anatoly knew. He always knew. And he waited. For 29 years, Reese said, understanding the terrible patience required. Until he found Natasha. Vivian pulled out the final file, Operation Silent Thunder, the mission that had killed Reese's mother. Anatoly had married an Afghan woman during the Soviet occupation. They had a son, Rashid. After the Soviets withdrew and his wife died, Anatoly raised Rashid in the mountains, trained him as a fighter. When Rashid became a Taliban commander, Anatoly made him a target. She showed Reese the operational details. Your mother was assigned to eliminate Rashid Qureshi. She didn't know he was Volkov's son, didn't know the intelligence was deliberately leaked. She recognized something was wrong, the timing too convenient, the setup too clean. She reported her concerns. The mission was approved anyway. And Mom went, Reese finished, even knowing it might be a trap. Because Rashid was a legitimate threat, because stopping him mattered more than her personal safety. She made the shot at 847 meters. Perfect conditions. Perfect execution. Then she held position for 8 minutes while her squad extracted, knowing Taliban forces were converging on her location. Vivian's voice cracked. Anatoly sacrificed his own son to create the opportunity to kill your mother. What kind of father does that? One who's forgotten everything except revenge, Reese said quietly. That evening, alone in her temporary quarters, Reese was cleaning her mother's rifle when an envelope slid silently under her door. Inside was a photograph that made her blood run cold. Natasha in full combat gear, prone position, eye to scope. Afghanistan mountains rising behind her. The image was taken through a rifle scope, crosshairs, centered perfectly on her mother's position. Date stamped March 17, 2021, the day Natasha died. Reese's hands trembled as she turned the photograph over. Handwritten in careful English. She was magnificent. 8 minutes, 17 seconds from first shot to final breath. She knew I was watching. Knew she was compromised. Completed mission anyway. Saved 17 Marines. Warrior recognizes warrior. Your grandmother created this. Your mother paid the price. What will you choose? AV. The room tilted. Volkov had been there, had watched her mother's last stand, had photographed it. But the words suggested something beyond cruelty. Warrior recognizes warrior. There was respect in that twisted phrase. Reese called for Jackson, and within minutes, security flooded the quarters. Vivian arrived pale-faced, examining the photograph with shaking hands. He was inside the base, Vivian said, her voice dangerously quiet. Again, despite everything we've put in place. Agent Mackenzie Reeves reviewed security footage, a brief visual distortion at 19:47, barely 3 seconds. When the camera cleared, the envelope was already delivered. He hacked our system, Reeves said with grudging admiration. Looped the footage. We're looking at a 3-second window where he could have been right there. Why send this to Reese? Jackson demanded. Communication, Reese said quietly. He's telling me he understands. That he watched Mom make the same choice he made, sacrifice for what you believe in. He sacrificed his son. Mom sacrificed herself. He's asking if I understand the cost. A second envelope arrived 30 minutes later at Vivian's quarters. Another photograph, young Rashid Qureshi in Taliban gear. On the back, my son, 28 years old, raised him in war, taught him everything, then used him as bait. What kind of father does that? What kind of woman raises daughters to be warriors, knowing they'll die in foreign lands? We are the same, Vivian, both monsters. I finally admit it. AV. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and brutal. He wants dialogue, Reese observed. If he just wanted revenge, we'd already be dead. He's trying to make us understand his perspective before whatever comes next. Before the ceremony, Vivian said with certainty, He's setting the stage. The evening before the ceremony, the Blackwood family gathered in Vivian's quarters. First real family dinner in 35 years. Vivian shared stories about young Natasha that only a mother who'd watched from shadows could know. "I was at your mother's 8th birthday," Vivian told Reese, voice thick with memory. "Foster parents threw a party. I stood across the street watching through binoculars. She looked so small, so alone, even surrounded by other children. I wanted to cross that street more than I've wanted anything. But crossing meant exposing her to Volkov's network. So I stayed in the shadows." "You were at Mom's wedding," Jackson said, remembering. "Back row left side, floral dress." "I cried through the entire ceremony," Vivian confirmed. "Watched you exchange vows. Watched Natasha's face when she said, 'I do.' She looked happier than I'd ever seen her. And I couldn't even tell her I was there." "You were at the hospital when I was born," Reese said, understanding flooding through here. "Waited in the parking lot for 6 hours. When Jackson carried you out in that pink blanket." Vivian's voice broke. "I saw my daughter's daughter. 3 generations. And I knew Volkov would never stop hunting. That my presence would mark you for death, just like it had marked Natasha." Reese moved around the table and hugged her grandmother. "You protected us the only way you could." "Did I?" Vivian whispered. "Your mother still died." "Because she chose to," Reese said firmly. "Because she was a warrior who protected others. That was her choice, grandmother. Not your fault." Later, Frost visited with an old journal, Gulf War-era notes. "Your mother asked me about advanced tactics before her final deployment. She was researching something specific." He showed Reese pages with notes referencing Berlin 1985 and Ghost Protocol. "Mom knew," Reese breathed. "She'd figured out you were alive before she deployed." Vivian stared at the notes, tears streaming. "She was trying to find me, and I never knew." The final document was Natasha's journal entry dated March 10, 2021, 1 week before her death. "If I'm right, my mother faked her death to protect me. After this deployment, I'm finding the truth. Lily deserves to know her grandmother. She died trying to reunite us," Reese said quietly. "Then tomorrow," Vivian replied, still entering her voice, "we make sure her death wasn't for nothing. We end this cycle. Together." The Naval Special Warfare Museum buzzed with controlled tension, masquerading as solemn ceremony. 300 attendees filled the hall, genuine mourners mixed with plainclothes operatives whose presence would be invisible to untrained eyes. Security was layered and comprehensive. Winters on the roof with a rifle. Hawks SEAL teams scattered throughout. Agent Reeves coordinating from command vehicle. Facial recognition running on all cameras. Reese stood backstage in her formal Navy dress, Natasha's trident pendant at her throat. Vivian adjusted the collar with grandmother's hands, the simple gesture carrying weight of decades of lost moments. "You don't have to do this," Vivian said quietly. "Yes, I do," Reese replied. "For Mom, for you, for everyone trapped in cycles they didn't create." The ceremony began. Admiral Blackburn presided with dignity. Former Marines shared stories of operations where Natasha's skills had saved lives. Jackson spoke of a wife and mother who'd understood that service meant sacrifice. Then Reese took the podium. "My mother taught me many things," she began, voice clear and steady. "She taught me to shoot, to calculate, to control my breathing. But those were just mechanics. The real lessons were about choice." She scanned the crowd, looking for anything matching Volkov's photographs. "Mom said every shot is a decision. Every target represents choosing to use lethal force when other options exist. She taught me that possessing skill wasn't enough. I needed wisdom to know when to use it and courage to choose restraint when circumstances demanded it." Near the back, an elderly man in a veteran's cap shifted slightly. The movement was subtle, but Reese's peripheral vision, trained through hundreds of hours of awareness, drills caught it. Her heart rate spiked, but she continued speaking. "3 days ago, I demonstrated the skills Mom taught me. I thought that was the best tribute, but I've learned something since then. The best way to honor Mom isn't duplicating her achievements. It's understanding why she made the choices she did." The elderly man was moving now, weaving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Security tracked him, waiting for confirmation. "My mother died protecting 17 Marines she'd never met," Reese declared, her voice strengthening. "She had 8 minutes to choose between saving herself and holding position. She chose them. That's not just courage. That's love." The man reached a position along the left wall. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Reese knew with absolute certainty Anatoly Volkov. He was smaller than expected. Thinner. Terminal illness visible in his gaunt features. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's dying grandfather. but his eyes were sharp, evaluating. And when he nodded slightly, acknowledging her recognition, Reese saw the professional assassin who'd orchestrated her mother's death. There are people who believe revenge is justice. Reese said, words now directed at Volkov, though only a handful understood this. That if someone harms your family, you must harm theirs. But that creates cycles that never end. Violence breeding violence until everyone forgets why it started. Volkov watched intently, expression unreadable. I won't continue that cycle, Reese declared. I won't let Mom's death justify more death. I won't spend my life hunting the people who hurt my family. I choose to honor Mom by being better than that, by being what she believed I could be. The room fell silent. Volkov remained motionless against the wall. Reese understood suddenly he hadn't come to attack. He'd come to witness, to see what Vivian's granddaughter would become, to understand whether the cycle would continue or break. So to anyone listening who's been hurt by choices my family made, Reese continued, speaking directly to Volkov. Now, I'm sorry. I can't undo the past. I can't bring back who you've lost. But I promise it ends here. No more revenge, no more blood debts. Just a choice to be better than our worst moments. She stepped back from the podium, waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Anatoly Volkov began moving toward the center aisle, approaching the stage with deliberate steps that sent ripples of tension through security personnel. Vivian positioned herself between Volkov and Reese. SEAL operators converged. But Volkov's hands remained visible, empty, raised in non-aggression. He stopped at the stage foot, looking up at Reese with an expression containing equal parts respect and profound sadness. May I speak? Volkov asked, his accent thick but English clear. The question was directed at Reese, not at the security surrounding him. Blackburn moved to intervene, but Reese raised her hand. Let him speak. FBI agents closed in, ready to act. But Vivian signaled them to hold. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Volkov looked around the crowd, then back to Reese. I am Anatoly Volkov, he said simply. I killed Natasha Blackwood. I orchestrated the ambush that ended her life. I used my own son as bait to create that opportunity. And I came here to look into the eyes of 3 generations and see what my choices have created. The museum erupted. Security moved to apprehend him. Volkov made no resistance, simply stood with hands raised while keeping his gaze on Reese. I am dying, Volkov continued as agents restrained him. Cancer. 3 months, perhaps less. I came knowing I'd be caught. I came because I needed to see whether this child would become what I have become, a creature of revenge or something better. Agent Reeves read him his rights, but Volkov kept speaking. You are 12 years old, and you have more wisdom than I achieved in 68 years. Volkov said, no mockery in his tone, only terrible recognition. Your mother died to protect strangers. My son died because I used him as a weapon. Which of us honored our children? Reese descended from the stage, moving past Vivian's protective position, past tensed security. She stopped 3 feet from Volkov. You destroyed your life for revenge, Reese said quietly. No hatred in her voice, only profound sadness. Mom built hers around protecting people. You're asking which deserves to be remembered. I think you already know. Volkov's shoulders sagged. I have something for you, he said as FBI secured his hands. Inside jacket pocket. Intelligence files. Complete truth about your mother's final operation. Not sanitized version. Agent Reeves extracted a thick envelope, examined it, passed it to Blackburn. Why tell us now? Vivian asked. Because I want someone to know that Natasha Blackwood was the finest warrior I ever faced, Volkov replied, looking at Vivian with something approaching respect. She knew my trap before stepping into it. She completed her mission anyway because stopping my son mattered more than her survival. I hated her for killing Rashid, but I respect her for choosing duty over safety. He paused, breathing labored. Your daughter was better than my son, better than me, better than what we made ourselves through decades of violence. The child understands this. I hope you do as well. As agents escorted Volkov toward exits, he stopped for one final statement. Your mother's last words were, tell my daughter that character matters more than skills. Always. I was monitoring radio frequencies. I heard her die. And in that moment, I understood that I had spent 40 years becoming exactly what she taught you not to be. Then he was gone. The museum remained in shocked silence before chaos erupted, 300 people processing what they'd witnessed. But Reese simply sat down, adrenaline draining away. Vivian sat beside her, pulling her granddaughter into an embrace that required no words. Jackson joined them moments later. Three of them sat together while federal agents processed a confrontation that had ended not with violence, but with quiet acknowledgement of terrible choices and irreversible consequences. The envelope Volkov carried contained exactly what he'd promised, complete operational files proving Natasha had known the mission was compromised, but chose to proceed anyway. And a handwritten letter to Reese Blackwood. You were right. Character matters more than skills. I learned this 68 years too late. Do not make my mistakes. Build something better than we built. AV. Reese read it 3 times each pass, revealing new layers in his careful phrasing. He sounds almost human, she said to Vivian. He was human, Vivian replied. That's what makes it tragic rather than simply evil. He made a choice to let hatred define him. And in the end, he recognized that choice destroyed not just his enemies, but himself. The cycle was broken, not through superior force, but through a 12-year-old's choice to forgive rather than perpetuate. Some wars end not with surrender, but with understanding. This one ended with both. The memorial ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, time to allow maximum attendance while providing optimal lighting conditions for the surveillance systems that had been covertly installed throughout the Naval Special Warfare Museum and surrounding grounds. By noon, personnel were arriving, a carefully curated mix of genuine mourners who'd served with Natasha and plainclothes security operatives whose presence would be invisible to anyone not trained to recognize them. Reese rode to the museum in an armored vehicle with Jackson and Vivian, the three of them silent as the weight of what was coming settled over them like a physical presence. Through tinted windows, Reese could see the museum growing closer, its familiar architecture now transformed into a battleground where the past would finally confront the present. Master Chief Winters met them at a secure entrance, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes conveying support that needed no words. Security is in place, Winters reported to Vivian. 6 rooftop positions with sniper overwatch, 42 plainclothes operatives distributed throughout the venue and surrounding area. Facial recognition software running on all entrances. FBI agent Mackenzie Reeves is coordinating from the command vehicle. SEAL Team 7 is staged at 3-minute response time. And Volkov? Vivian asked. No confirmed sighting yet, Winters replied. But we have reports of a man matching his description checking into a hotel in La Jolla 2 days ago. He's been conducting counter-surveillance checking for tails. He knows we're looking for him. Good, Vivian said with grim satisfaction. Let him know we're prepared. It won't stop him from coming. Inside the museum, the memorial had been arranged with meticulous attention to both ceremonial dignity and tactical advantage. Natasha's service photograph dominated the main hall, enlarged to poster size and mounted beside a memorial plaque. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where speakers would offer remembrances. Security cameras hidden in decorative elements covered every angle, their feeds monitored by technicians in the command vehicle outside. Admiral Blackburn would preside over the ceremony, lending official gravitas that made the event appear legitimate to any outside observer. The program included remarks from Natasha's former commanding officer's testimony, from Marines whose lives she'd saved, and finally a brief tribute from Reese herself. As 2 o'clock approached and attendees filled the chairs, Reese stood backstage with Vivian reviewing her prepared remarks while simultaneously scanning the arriving guests for any sign of the man they were expecting. He'll wait until the ceremony is underway, Vivian predicted. Maximum emotional impact. He wants us off balance when he reveals himself. The ceremony began with military precision. Admiral Blackburn spoke of Natasha's service record, her exceptional abilities, her ultimate sacrifice. Former Marines shared stories of operations where Natasha's skills had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The testimonials painted a picture of a warrior who'd been both extraordinarily talented and deeply human. Jackson spoke briefly, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. He talked about Natasha as a wife and mother, about the care she'd taken to ensure Reese grew up understanding that strength came in many forms, that the ability to take life required equal ability to preserve it. And then it was Reese's turn. She walked to the podium with the same calm focus she brought to the shooting range, aware that 300 pairs of eyes were watching, that somewhere among those faces might be the man who'd killed her mother. My mother taught me many things, Reese began, her young voice carrying clearly through the acoustically designed space. She taught me to shoot straight, to calculate wind drift and bullet drop, to control my breathing and squeeze the trigger smoothly. But those were just mechanics. The real lessons were about choice. Reese paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled faces, looking for anything that matched the photograph she'd studied of an older Anatoly Volkov. Near the back of the hall, an elderly man in a veteran's cap shifted slightly. The movement was subtle, but Reese's peripheral vision, trained through hundreds of hours of situational awareness drills, caught it. She didn't look directly at him, didn't signal recognition, but her heart rate increased, adrenaline sharpening her focus. Mom said that every shot is a decision. Every target represents a choice to use lethal force when other options exist. She taught me that possessing skill wasn't enough. I needed wisdom to know when to use it and courage to choose not to when circumstances demanded restraint. Vivian, watching from the side of the stage, had also spotted the elderly man. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly to touch her ear, activating the communication system that connected her to the security teams. Her lips barely moved as she sub-vocalized possible contact southeast quadrant. On rooftops across from the museum, sniper teams adjusted their positions. In the crowd, plainclothes operators began moving with casual purpose, closing potential escape routes while maintaining the appearance of normal attendance. My mother died protecting 17 Marines she'd never met. Reese continued, her voice growing stronger. She had 8 minutes to choose between saving herself and holding a position that would allow her squad to escape. She chose them. That's not just courage. That's love. Love for people whose names she didn't know, whose faces she'd never remember, but whose lives mattered to her anyway. The elderly man was moving now, not toward exits, but deeper into the venue, working his way along the sidewall with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent a lifetime in covert operations. Security personnel tracked his movement, maintaining distance, waiting for confirmation before acting. I've learned that my mother's legacy isn't measured in confirmed kills or commendations. It's measured in the lives she saved and the choices she made when those choices cost her everything. That's what I want to remember. That's what I want to become. Not a warrior who counts victories, but a person who understands that the hardest battles are the ones we fight against our own worst impulses. Reese paused again, and this time she looked directly at the elderly man who'd now reached a position along the left wall where he could see both the stage and the exits. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment of contact, Reese knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at Anatoly Volkov. He was smaller than she'd expected, thinner. The terminal illness Admiral Blackburn had mentioned was visible in the gaunt quality of his face, the careful way he moved that suggested pain being managed through willpower alone. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's dying grandfather dressed in his best clothes for a solemn occasion. But his eyes were sharp, evaluating, and when he nodded slightly in acknowledgement that he knew she'd recognized him, Reese saw in that small gesture the professional assassin who'd orchestrated her mother's death. There are people in this world who believe that revenge is justice. Reese said her words now, directed specifically at Volkov, though only a handful of people in the room understood this. That if someone harms your family, the only appropriate response is to harm theirs. But that creates cycles that never end. Violence breeding violence across generations until everyone forgets why it started, only that it must continue. Volkov was watching her intently now, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting someone listening to an argument they'd heard before but never quite believed. I won't continue that cycle, Reese declared, her voice ringing with conviction that came from 3 days of intensive thought about this exact moment. I won't let my mother's death become justification for more death. I won't spend my life hunting the people who hurt my family. I choose to honor Mom by being better than that, by being what she believed I could be. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone present sensing that something profound was happening, even if they didn't understand the full context. Volkov remained motionless against the wall, and Reese realized with sudden clarity that he hadn't come here to attack. He'd come to witness, to see what Vivian's granddaughter would become, to understand whether the cycle would continue or break. So to anyone listening who's been hurt by the choices my family made, Reese continued, speaking directly to Volkov now, without naming him. I'm sorry, I can't undo the past. I can't bring back the people you've lost. But I can promise that it ends here. No more revenge. No more blood debts. Just a choice to be better than our worst moments. Reese stepped back from the podium, her prepared remarks complete, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. She'd done what she came to do. Now the question was whether it would be enough. For a long moment, nothing happened. The assembled crowd seemed frozen, uncertain whether to applaud or remain silent. And then Anatoly Volkov began moving again, not toward the exits, but toward the center aisle, approaching the stage with deliberate steps that sent ripples of tension through the security personnel tracking him. Vivian stepped forward, positioning herself between Volkov and Reese, her hand near the concealed weapon she carried, despite this being a memorial service. SEAL team operators began converging from multiple directions, preparing to intervene if Volkov made any threatening gesture. But Volkov's hands remained visible, empty, raised slightly in a gesture of non-aggression. He stopped at the foot of the stage, looking up at Reese with an expression that was impossible to fully interpret, but seemed to contain equal parts respect and profound sadness. "May I speak?" Volkov asked, his accent thick, but his English perfectly clear. The question was directed at Reese, not at the security personnel surrounding him or the admiral presiding over the ceremony. Blackburn moved to intervene, but Reese raised her hand, asking for a moment to make her own choice. "Let him speak," Reese said quietly. FBI agents moved closer, ready to tackle Volkov at the first sign of threat, but Vivian signaled them to hold position. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the confrontation that would either end in bloodshed or something approaching resolution. Volkov looked around the assembled crowd, then back to Reese, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 40 years spent carrying hatred that had finally grown too heavy to bear. "I am Anatoly Volkov," he said simply, not bothering to deny or obscure his identity. "I killed Natasha Blackwood. I orchestrated the ambush that ended her life. I used my own son as bait to create that opportunity. And I came here today to look into the eyes of 3 generations and see what my choices have created." The museum erupted into chaos as security personnel moved to apprehend him, but Volkov made no attempt to resist. He simply stood with his hands raised, waiting for them to secure him while keeping his gaze locked on Reese. "I am dying," Volkov continued, even as FBI agents moved to restrain him. "Cancer, 3 months, perhaps less. I came to America knowing I would be caught. I came because I needed to see whether this child would become what I have become, a creature of revenge, a person whose entire existence is defined by hatred for those who harmed their family." Agent Reeves was reading Volkov his rights, but the dying Russian continued speaking, his words directed solely at Reese. "You are 12 years old and you have more wisdom than I achieved in 68 years of living," Volkov said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only a terrible recognition of wasted time. "Your mother died to protect people she did not know. My son died because I used him as a weapon against my enemies. Which of us honored our children? Which of us deserves to be remembered?" Reese descended from the stage, moving past Vivian's protective position, past the security personnel who tensed but didn't prevent her approach. She stopped 3 feet from Volkov, close enough to see the pain in his eyes, the regret that had come too late to matter. "You destroyed your life for revenge," Reese said quietly, and there was no hatred in her voice, only a kind of profound sadness for the waste of it all. "My mother built her life around protecting people. You're asking which deserves to be remembered. I think you already know the answer." Volkov's shoulders sagged slightly, the last of his defiance crumbling in the face of simple truth delivered by a child young enough to be his great-granddaughter. "I have something for you," Volkov said, as the FBI agent secured his hands behind his back. "Inside my jacket pocket, intelligence files, the complete truth about your mother's final operation. Not the sanitized version you have been given, the reality." Agent Reeves carefully extracted a thick envelope from Volkov's jacket, examining it for threats, before passing it to Admiral Blackburn for review. "Why tell us now?" Vivian asked, speaking for the first time since Volkov had revealed himself. "Because I want someone to know that Natasha Blackwood was the finest warrior I ever faced," Volkov replied, looking at Vivian with something approaching respect despite 40 years of enmity. "She knew my trap before she stepped into it. She recognized the intelligence was compromised. And she completed the mission anyway because stopping my son was more important than her survival. I hated her for killing Rashid, but I respect her for choosing duty over safety." He paused, his breathing labored, the cancer asserting itself despite whatever medication was keeping him functional. "Your daughter was better than my son," Volkov said to Viviani. "Better than me. Better than what we made ourselves through decades of violence. The child understands this. I hope you do as well." As FBI agents began the escorting Volkov toward the exits, he stopped for one final statement directed at Reese. "Your mother's last words were, 'Tell my daughter that character matters more than skills. Always.' I was monitoring the radio frequencies. I heard her die, and in that moment I understood that I had spent 40 years becoming exactly what she taught you not to be." Then Volkov was gone, led away by federal agents to begin processing that would end with him in a hospital bed rather than a prison cell time measured in weeks rather than years. The museum remained in shocked silence for several seconds before the chaos of 300 people trying to process what they just witnessed created a crescendo of conversation and confusion. Admiral Blackburn moved quickly to secure the venue, requesting that all attendees remain while statements were collected and the security situation was fully resolved. But Reese simply sat down in the nearest chair, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation draining away and leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Her hands trembled now, delayed reaction to standing 3 feet from her mother's killer and choosing words over weapons. Vivienne sat beside her granddaughter, pulling Reese into an embrace that required no words. For long moments, they simply held each other while federal agents and military personnel swirled around them, processing a confrontation that had ended not with V9, but with the quiet acknowledgement of terrible choices and their irreversible consequences. Jackson joined them, completing the circle. His hand found Reese's shoulder, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone in processing what had just happened. "You were incredible," Jackson whispered. "Your mother would be so proud." "I was terrified," Reese admitted, her voice small in a way it hadn't been during the confrontation itself. "The whole time, I thought he might have a weapon, might try something." "But you spoke anyway," Vivienne said softly. "That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but choosing to act despite it." The envelope Volkov had carried contained exactly what he'd promised: complete operational details of the mission that had killed Natasha. Tactical maps, radio intercepts, photographs taken from Volkov's observation position, and a timeline that confirmed what Vivienne had suspected. Natasha had known the mission was compromised, but had chosen to proceed anyway. The final document was Volkov's handwritten letter to Reese, composed in careful English, that suggested he'd labored over every word. Reese read it 3 times each pass, revealing new layers of meaning in the careful phrasing of a man trying to articulate regret he'd spent 40 years refusing to feel. "He sounds almost human," Reese said quietly to Vivienne, as they sat in a secure debriefing room hours after the ceremony had ended. "He was human," Vivienne replied. "That's what makes it tragic rather than simply evil." Anatoly Volkov was capable of love. He raised a son, served his country with distinction. But he allowed one terrible loss to poison everything that came after. 1 week later, Reese found herself in an interrogation room at a federal medical facility where Anatoly Volkov lay propped up in bed, cancer visibly consuming him despite medication keeping him functional. She hadn't planned to visit him, but something Volkov had written in his letter kept circulating through her mind. "I want someone to know that Natasha Blackwood was the finest warrior I ever faced." "You came," Volkov said, his voice weaker than it had been at the museum. "I wasn't certain you would." "I'm not sure why I did," Reese admitted honestly. "You killed my mother. I should hate you." "You should," Volkov agreed. "I would in your position." "But I don't," Reese discovered as she spoke the words. "I'm angry. I wish Mom was still alive. But I don't hate you. I just feel sorry for you, for all the years you wasted on revenge." Volkov's laugh was bitter. "I came here expecting hatred. Instead, I find pity from a child. Perhaps that's the punishment I deserve." "I didn't come to punish you," Reese said. "I came because you said Mom was the finest warrior you'd faced. I want to understand what you meant." Volkov's expression shifted to something approaching reverence as he described watching Natasha's final stand. 8 minutes and 17 seconds of covering fire while her squad extracted. The professional execution despite knowing she was in a kill zone. The choice to complete the mission over self-preservation. "I raised Rashid to be warrior," Volkov concluded, "but I made him weapon. Your mother was both warrior and protector. One of those is noble, other is just destructive. I finally understand difference. 68 years too late, but I understand." Reese reached across the space between them and did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She took Volkov's hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing Mom clearly, for recognizing what she was." "She was better than me," Volkov whispered. "Better than what I made myself." "Tell her story, child. Tell everyone what 8 minutes of selfless courage looks like." "I will," Reese promised. Volkov died 3 weeks later, having provided extensive intelligence that dismantled networks and closed cases across decades. His final words, according to the nurse present, were in Russian. "Alexei Rashid, I'm sorry I wasted what you gave me." 6 months after Volkov's arrest, the dedication ceremony for the Peace Garden was smaller than the memorial service that had preceded it, but more intimate, more meaningful. Reese stood beside the sculpture of her mother, bronze rendered with care by an artist who'd captured not triumph but watchfulness, not aggression but protection. The dedication plaque read, "The Natasha Wraith Blackwood Memorial Garden, in honor of warriors who choose protection over destruction." That evening, the Blackwood family gathered at Vivienne's house for dinner, a tradition that had developed over 6 months of rebuilding what had been broken by decades of necessary separation. The empty chair with its folded flag represented Natasha. But tonight there was also a second small memorial, a compass that had belonged to Volkov's brother Alexei, placed beside a photograph of Rashid Qureshi. Not to honor them, but to remember that every life lost represented someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. To all warriors, Vivian toasted, who understood the cost of violence even as they wielded it. May we honor them by choosing better when we can. Later, Jackson found Reese standing alone in the backyard looking up at the stars. You okay, kiddo? I was thinking about Volkov, Reese admitted, about how he spent 40 years hating. And at the end, he said it was all wasted. Do you think Mom would have forgiven him? Jackson considered carefully. I think your mother understood that everyone makes choices with the information and emotions they have in the moment. Volkov chose revenge. Mom chose protection. But I think she would have recognized his humanity even while opposing his actions. I want to be like that, Reese said. Strong enough to stand up for what's right, but wise enough to recognize that even enemies are human. You already are, Jackson assured her. 3 years later, Reese Blackwood, now 15, stood before her first class of Project Nightingale students at Naval Base San Diego. The program had grown from concept to reality, serving 87 military dependents across 6 installations. My mother taught me to shoot, Reese told the assembled students, but her greatest gift wasn't marksmanship. It was understanding that skills are morally neutral. It's our choices that define whether we build or destroy. Behind her on the wall hung 3 photographs, Natasha in combat gear, Vivian from her intelligence days, and Reese herself at age 12 standing beside Colonel Thorne, who transformed from skeptic to Project Nightingale's most passionate advocate. You are not your parents' records, Reese declared. You are the choices you make every single day. After class, Master Chief Winters found her reviewing student evaluations. Your mother would be proud, Winters said, not of your shooting scores, though those are still impressive. Proud that you chose to help people instead of simply being like her. I am like her, Reese corrected gently. I'm protecting people, just with different tools. That afternoon, Vivian took Reese to Precision Point Range, the place where everything had changed 3 years earlier. They shot together, grandmother and granddaughter, not in competition, but in communion. At 800 meters, Reese made the shot she'd practiced for years. Perfect. Dead center. For Mom, I am, Reese said quietly, for everyone who chose protection over destruction. Vivian pulled her granddaughter close. You know what your mother's greatest achievement was? Saving 17 Marines. Creating you, Vivian corrected. Everything else was important. But you're her legacy. Not the kills, not the records. You. 15 years later, Dr. Reese Blackwood, age 30, clinical psychologist specializing in veteran trauma, published her first book, 8 Minutes Understanding, Sacrifice Processing, Loss, Choosing Meaning. The dedication read simply, for Mom who gave 8 minutes that created countless futures, and for grandmother who finally got to be a grandmother. The book became required reading at several military academies, not for its technical content, but for its unflinching examination of what service costs and how those left behind can honor sacrifice without being destroyed by it. And every year on March 17th, the anniversary of Natasha's death, Reese returned to the Memorial Garden in San Diego, where bronze Natasha stood eternal watch. This year, she brought her nephew Nathan, now 7, to meet the grandmother he'd never known. Tell me about her, Nathan asked as he always did. And Reese told him, not just about the warrior, but about the woman. Not just about the sacrifice, but about the choice. Not just about the death, but about what the life had meant. Nathan placed a small flower on the memorial, a tradition now passing to a 3rd generation. I'll remember Aunt Reese, I promise. The sun was setting over San Diego, the same golden California light that had illuminated Reese's first visit to the base 15 years earlier. Now 27, Reese stood at Precision Point Range one final time before moving to Washington, D.C. for a position at the VA developing trauma recovery programs nationwide. Vivian and Jackson stood with her 3 generations bound by love and loss and the choice to keep building, despite the weight of history. One more shot, Vivian suggested. One more, Reese agreed. She settled into position at 800 meters. 4-count breathing. Environmental check. Micro adjustments. The natural pause between heartbeats. The trigger broke cleanly. The shot was perfect. For Mom, Reese said, standing. For grandmother. For everyone who chose to protect. And for everyone learning that protection comes in many forms. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beyond the range, eternal and indifferent. But the people standing together on this California afternoon weren't indifferent. They remembered. They honored. They chose to carry forward the best while releasing the worst. "Ready to go?" Jackson asked gently. "Almost," Reese said, taking one last look at the range where she'd proven herself 15 years ago. On the target stand at 800 meters, her final shot had struck dead center. But Reese didn't need to verify that. She knew. The point wasn't accuracy. The point was choice. The point was understanding that some legacies were meant to be transformed rather than simply continued. Natasha Blackwood had been a warrior who chose protection. Vivian Blackwood had been a ghost who chose sacrifice. Reese Blackwood was a healer who chose transformation. 3 generations, 3 different paths. One shared understanding that love persists beyond death, that choices define us more than circumstances, and that the greatest victories are measured not in enemies defeated, but in futures created. As they walked away from the range together, grandmother, father's daughter, the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Behind them, the target stood silent. Ahead, the future waited. Some cycles break. Some legacies transform. Some 12-year-old girls grow into women who understand that the hardest shot is always the one you choose not to take. The Wraith's legacy endured, not through violence, but through values. Not through weapons, but through wisdom. Not through revenge, but through remembrance that honored the best while releasing the worst. The cycle was broken. The peace was real. And the future belonged to the living who would honor the dead by building lives worth living.